Hello everyone, this is Paul B, and welcome to part 2 of my two-part series, Scientology Clips, confirm Meannesota.com. The first thing I wanted to do was to just comment a bit on the first part. And the first thing I would say is that if you didn't notice, in the show notes to the in the YouTube description to the first video. See, I called it show notes because before my life was destroyed by Meannesota, I did a lot of podcasting. I was one of the first podcasters out there way back. Geez, I don't remember. Very early 2000s. And we had show notes. But this is YouTube. So in the YouTube description, there are some links that I put there too. Not only the parent videos of the clips that you saw in part 1, but at least one or two other links that will help you understand what Scientology really is as quickly as possible. I would say there's an hour and a half's worth of videos there. If you watch all of that, you're going to really know everything you need to know about Scientology. One of the things in there, forgive the rather schizophrenic presentation in part 1. Remember, when I first started, I ended up with a 6-hour presentation, and even that wasn't enough, so I had to stop and try to reduce it. So I ended up using a lot of the original clips in there. So, for instance, I referred to Stacy, who I told you about before. Well, I hadn't told you about her before in the new video. That was in the original. So please forgive any kind of snafus like that you'll find. One of the other things, I didn't really focus on Scientology's criminality. You know, there's a lot of people doing great work out there, and if you look online, you're going to find it all, but I just feel like I should at least expose you to it. I should let you understand what you're dealing with Scientology in the broad sense. So, let me just give you a quick rundown of their criminality that is pretty well documented. Back in 1970, the first expose was published about Scientology. Okay, so this is 1970. This is only 3 and 4 years after those interviews with L. Ron Hubbard that you saw in the first video. Now, at the time those videos were made of L. Ron Hubbard, he was living on a ship. He lived on a ship in the high seas for 5 years, and the reason is because he would have been probably arrested and prosecuted if he had made land anywhere. So if he's sitting in international waters, he's untouchable. But of course, that's where he learned how to become a megalomaniac who really almost enslaved his followers and abused them, and that has carried on through Scientology ever since. That's what was exposed in this 1970 book. What they did was they exercised their ethics, their fair game against suppressives with her, which is to harm and utterly destroy them. They did things like, and I'm not saying they did this, but they did things like this. Break into her house, take some objects out of her desk and out of her kitchen and place them on the counter in the bathroom. You know, just things to let her know that at any given moment someone else can be inside her home, and she knows exactly who they are. You know, to terrify her. Their goal was to drive her crazy or to inspire her to commit suicide. And you know what? I'm going to stop right there and bring this on. Suicidal thoughts have gone through my mind for the last 3 years. I called the suicide hotline. They're the people who sent me to Homeline, who did absolutely nothing for me. Homeline was that free renter's assistance who never even responded to me. The suicide hotline sent me there. I have been fighting thoughts of suicide certainly for the last year. And you know what? That's exactly what Meannesota wants. They want me gone. They want me out of the picture so that I never raise a complaint again, so that I never expose them again. So there's your first connection between Scientology and Meannesota. When that didn't work, they took off the gloves. They went in and they took some paper, just normal typewriter paper, that had her fingerprints on it out of her home, and they wrote bomb threats to the United Nations and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. And then they sent in a tip saying that this woman, who was a journalist, had sent in these bomb threats. She spent, I think, something like $30,000 in 1970 money fighting this, and she was losing. She was well on her way to going to prison, maybe for the rest of her life, for something she had nothing to do with after being framed by Scientology. The only reason she did not go to prison is because the fact that she had been framed was discovered in another operation with Scientology. Now, this thing calls itself a church, and it's running intelligence operations. Remember, L. Ron Hubbard fancied himself the commodore of his ship, the guru of his cult, the leader. He wanted to be supreme leader. He wanted to be a king. In fact, if you watch another video with his close colleagues, they said one reason he was on the high seas was to look for some land where he could buy it or have it ceded to him by a government, and he could form his own nation where he could be a dictator. That's what Scientology is. Later in the 70s, there was another operation, and you've never heard this, and the reason is because the news media is too frightened of Scientology to tell you about it. But if you look for it, you'll find it. Just go to Google and search Operation Snow White. Operation Snow White is when Scientology committed the largest espionage infiltration of the United States government in American history. More than anything that is known by the Soviet Union, more than anything that is known by Communist China, more than anything that is known by Israel. And remember, Pollard was sent to prison spying for Israel. I think he was recently released, or he's about to be released. And yet, the largest espionage infiltration of the United States government was by Scientology. What they did was they sent their members to get jobs at the IRS and wherever, the FBI, maybe with Congress, and they just stole documents hand and foot, copied them, stole them. They placed bugs. I mean, this is the kind of stuff J. Edgar Hoover would have done. And if you wonder why Scientology is recognized as a religion, a tax-exempt religion, all you have to know is that they gathered enough blackmail material there, including when they bugged the IRS, which is the one that gives you tax-exempt status as a religion, by the way. So I think you can see what's going on here. And yet, Scientology points to the fact that certain governments call them a tax-exempt religion as proof that they are, in fact, a religion. The problem is, they don't have a sanctuary, they don't have a God, you don't pray. There's nothing religious about it. It's a business, it's a business, it's a corporation that sells mind control to its own customers. It's a cult. It's a cult that figured out how to make money hand over fist. Now, if you think about that carefully, this relates to a video I did a few weeks ago with Sibel Edmonds. She was an FBI whistleblower, and she was blowing the whistle on the fact that the FBI was surveilling members of Congress, specifically Dennis Hastert, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who was into pedophilia. But rather than prosecuting these people for these crimes, they were doing something else with that information. Now, here's the question. Have you ever wondered why over the last 20 years the U.S. government, Congress, has not done its job? Have you ever wondered why they keep passing law after law that seems as if it's designed specifically to destroy the United States of America, or at least to destroy constitutional government? Have you ever wondered why the Supreme Court keeps upholding these rulings that seem designed to destroy the United States of America? I mean, do you just think the world's gone crazy, or is it possible that these entities that are gathering all this information on these people, rather than prosecuting them, and we know they're not being prosecuted because none of them are in prison, none of them are in court, is it possible that that information is being used to blackmail them to get things like Obamacare passed and upheld in the Supreme Court, something that is so blatantly unconstitutional? You couldn't write something that's more unconstitutional, forcing people at gunpoint to spend their money on a commercial product that they find morally reprehensible. There's nothing more unconstitutional than that. Well, that's what Scientology apparently did here. And yet, they point to the fact that the government calls them a religion and gives them tax-exempt status as proof that they're a religion. Well, here you go, back to Meannesota. In Meannesota, if you go into the forums, if you go to my Meannesota section of my website and look at the third-party confirmations, you'll find that apologists for Minnesota, which is really Minnesota, but they don't know the difference either, apologists, when someone comes out and says, these people destroyed my life, or these people behave like they're crazy. Um, I can't interact with these people. They don't behave normally. When someone comes out and just tells a true story, just telling what happened to them in Minnesota, these apologists will come out, and the only way they can try to fight it is to point out polls and surveys and statistics that show that Minnesota is the most charitable people per capita in the country. They have more churches per capita than any other state. They just pull out all these statistics and numbers and polls and surveys. And again, a lot of them come from the University of Minnesota, of all places. It's the same thing that Scientology is doing here. They have absolutely nothing to support in the real world to support the idea that it's a religion. They don't have a God, they don't pray, they don't have a sanctuary. Nothing. There's nothing. It looks like a corporate office, not a church. They can only point to the fact that the government gives them the status, the tax-exempt status, as proof that they're a religion. That's what Meannesota does. They can't, in the real world, point out to where all these people are really nice and charitable and generous and kind and compassionate. So what do? They go to these studies and surveys from, peer-reviewed, sources, and they use that as what they call proof that Minnesota is, in fact, the nicest, kindest, most compassionate, most generous, most charitable people in the country. It's the same thing that Scientology does. And this is my point all along, is that there is no cult out there that fundamentally resembles the way that Meannesota operates more than Scientology. Of course, with this espionage Operation Snow White, L. Ron Hubbard's own wife went to jail for this. But that doesn't change the fact that they gathered an awful lot of information, and that could have been used against government officials all along, which helps to explain why Scientology still exists, rather than being dismantled, investigated, prosecuted, and its leaders thrown into prison and or a straitjacket. Scientology hires private investigators to go out and find dirt on people. And by the way, dirt, this is one of the things that started my Third World American project back in 1996. When I was studying computer science in the 90s, I recognized that it wasn't going to go well. It was being used to gather information to use as a weapon, and that information itself was going to become a commodity as valuable as oil or gold. Nobody believed me. Nobody wanted to hear it. Oh no, computers are going to help us. They're going to save paper and save trees, and we're only going to have to work 4 hours a day because the computers will do all the work. That's what these people were saying back then. And I'm saying, no, that's not what's going to happen. These things are going to turn us into slaves. And specifically in terms of information gathering and the use of information against you as a weapon. And the government's going to get hold of it, and it's just going to take off toward tyranny from there. And that's exactly what happened after 9/11 with the Patriot Act and such. Nobody wanted to hear it, though. So my point is that when they gather what they call dirt on you, it doesn't have to be dirt. And this is what I was saying with Third World American. All they have to do is gather information on you, because if they know enough about you, they can present it rhetorically in a way that sounds bad when it isn't. Might be completely benign. You could do nothing wrong, commit no crimes, just be an ordinary person, a sinner, but, nobody's perfect, but, you don't do anything horrifically wrong. But if they know enough about you that is accurate, they can use the tactics of language manipulation and rhetoric to present that accurate information in a way that sounds like you're a sleazeball. I'll give you an example. There was a Mad Magazine article that had a political speech, and this guy was the whole speech just talked about his opponent and what a bum his opponent was. The thing was, they used words that people didn't understand, so they would say things like, his mother is a proselyte in a church. Most people who don't know what he's talking about would just think he's saying she's a prostitute in a church. But she's a proselyte. In other words, someone who goes out like a missionary, right? So, through this whole speech, he's saying nothing but great things about his opponent, but he's using these words that people who aren't very well educated will interpret as horrible crimes. And in the end, his opponent just sounds like this total dirtbag. That's exactly what Scientology does. And frankly, that's exactly what Meannesota does. They're very clever using language as a weapon against you. Now, for this next part about Scientology, I want you to imagine that you went to church every Sunday, And rather than a voluntary offering or tithe, you're told that you cannot sit and listen to the pastor speak unless you pay them $200. So in other words, you have to pay for the sermon. Does that sound like a church to you, or does that sound like a business? Scientology, of course, they don't have any religion. They don't have any sermons. They just have these courses that with L. Ron Hubbard babbling his nonsense. You have to pay for those, and they're very expensive. To make it all the way through to the very top, you have to go through all these levels, and they're very secret. You're not supposed to know, and before the internet, people didn't know what was in these high levels, the levels that like Tom Cruise and John Travolta have reached, because they can afford to pay for it. It costs like, $500,000 to get there. And when you get there, you start realizing Hubbard's science fiction story that underlied Scientology from the beginning. All this, UFOs and aliens and extraterrestrials and past lives, and it just turns into absolute crazy at that point. And of course, by that time you spent $500,000 and been sucked into this, you're not really one who wants to go stand in front of a camera and say, I kind of got sucked into a cult. And if you're Tom Cruise, are you going to want to do that? Are you going to want to go in front of cameras and say, I kind of wasted 20 years of my life. I was given this tremendous blessing by all of you, my fans, who made me rich and famous and wealthy, and I could do anything I wanted with my life. And you gave me that as fair exchange for the pleasure I gave you with my films, and I rewarded you by just wasting all of that you gave me, and I went out and joined a crazy cult and made a bunch of criminals rich, basically. If you're Tom Cruise, do you want to come out and say that to the world? I wish he would. Frankly, I would forgive him if he did more than I forgive him now. People like him and Travolta and all these celebrities who were given every opportunity that those of us who work for a living don't have, I don't forgive them a bit for joining that cult. It was voluntary. They did it on their own. And frankly, when celebrities do that, they shouldn't be allowed to act anymore. I mean, in the sense that people should boycott their movies. They should just say, no, we're not. These people stood up as role models. They took that upon themselves. They took our money. They were willing to go out there and be wealthy and not have to work hard for a living like we do. Not having to worry about food, feeding our children like we do. And what did they do with it? They went out and joined a cult. Shame on them. Shame on them. Shame on you, Tom Cruise, John Travolta. I really enjoyed your films, but what you did with it is a bitch slap in the face of every one of your fans. How dare you do something like that to us? You could have done anything you wanted with your lives. You could have taken all that fame and fortune and done something really wonderful to the world, and all you did was pursue something in your own narcissistic, twisted mind where you could make yourself feel like you're important with this Scientology bullshit. It's all about you. You. Shame on you. So Scientology charges money for these courses. And a lot of money. And if you get in trouble with their ethics program, you get sent into their ethics program, you have to pay for that as well. So anyway, this is just a money sieve. It's just going to suck all your money. The average person who only makes $1 million in their whole lifetime, it's all going to be gone at these prices. And one of the things that Scientology does is encourages, and by all reports uses effective human manipulation tactics, psychological tactics. And again, on paper, they're totally opposed to psychology, right? That's anathema to them. But there are people who sell these courses use all that kind of psychology and human manipulation, rhetoric, propaganda, to encourage Scientologists to do things like get a second or third mortgage on their home to pay for these courses, or to max out their credit cards. And that is why Scientologists as a group are probably the worst financially off people in the United States of America. They're just financially devastated. And this has an analog out there in the world with another kind of subculture that I've been after for a long time, the student loan racketeering industry. You take an 18 to 25-year-old, no real world experience, no experience being on their own, and they get sit in front of a student loan officer who has no legal obligation to tell them anything about the consequences of what they're about to sign. Doesn't tell them that student loans are unlike any other loan in the United States. You can't file for bankruptcy. They have no standard consumer protections like every other loan does. They will come after you for the rest of your life. You can take out a loan for, say, $10,000 and in the end up paying $150,000, or you could go to the grave still owing $500,000 that these people can just throw on. They can just give you a phone call and then in their books write down $500 as a fee or a collections charge for calling you, even though you didn't answer the phone. And there's no regulation to stop them from doing that. They don't tell you that all these people at very high levels in the government, all the way up, are bought and paid for by the student loan industry. They don't tell you any of that stuff. They just say, you've got to have a quality education to get a good job. You don't want to make your parents ashamed, do you? You don't want to end up working at McDonald's, do you? This education is your only way out of a miserable life. I mean, this is the kind of sales pitch that student loan officers use. So on the one hand, they do everything they can to inspire people to sign those papers. Just get their signatures on the papers. Nothing else matters. Just get that legal signature on the paper. And then, for the rest of their life, the people figure out what it is that they just signed. It's a criminal racket. It's the same thing that Scientology does with selling these courses and encouraging people using those same kind of guilt and shame tactics and such to mortgage their houses, spend their children's college funds, max out their credit cards, do whatever it takes to buy these courses just so that 20 years later they can learn about UFOs and extraterrestrials and all this nonsense that's spewed out of the creative mind of L. Ron Hubbard. And they call that a religion. This so-called religion breaks up families. If you have a family and one or more of the members are not in good standing, they will be pushed away. You will be encouraged to dissociate from them. And I mean strongly encouraged. The number of families that have been broken up by Scientology is incalculable. The imprisonment, kidnapping, abuse, hunger, the things that... exploitation, overwork, I mean basically slavery is what goes on in many of the hidden parts of Scientology. And again, if you go online, just look for these things, you will find them. They're all over the place. In fact, I believe you're going to see a clip here in this video. So the question is, if that is what Scientology is, and yet they go on television and they portray themselves as something as ordinary as the Lutheran Church, and yet this is what's really going on. The question is, why hasn't the government gone in there with the broadest and deepest investigation in American history and put an end to this? Why hasn't it gone in there and rescued those children who are being enslaved and abused? Why hasn't it gone in there and seized this money and distributed it among its victims? Why hasn't it put Miss Cabbage and other people in prison or in a straitjacket or both? Now, it might go back to what we said before, where they were doing so much spying and infiltration and hiring private investigators that they've blackmailed all of these public officials. That's probably part of it at some level, but at the broader part, the government just doesn't care. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, in Minnesota, they're talking about, they're just throwing out Senator Amy Klobuchar's name as a possible replacement on the Supreme Court for Justice Scalia. So we have Senators Klobuchar and Al Franken. Which one of those two, while they open and close their mouths all day long about, the children, we got to save the children, we got to help the children. For example, when they steal an extra $2 to $3 each day from each of the 1 million tobacco users in Minnesota, money that could have been used for something else, like, I don't know, raising their children, something like that. But instead it goes to the government. And then they use that money to raise their own salaries and to build a football stadium. But out of their mouths is coming the whole time, well, we need this money to save the children. We got to save the children, help the children. Children are being destroyed by tobacco. They're all dying. It's genocide. And yet they go out and they spend the money on everything but anything to do with tobacco. All right? So you've got Amy Klobuchar, Al Franken in our federal government representing Minnesota. The children, we got to save the children, blah, 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 blah. What have they ever done to shut down Scientology? Because Scientology is kidnapping people, including children. It is separating children from their families. It is forcing children to be raised with a deliberately insufficient education, which again is very similar to Meannesota. I mean, their education program ignores many of the fundamentals that you need to survive in this world and to thrive. There was a clip here, I probably won't play it today, but this girl who explained everything that she went through as a slave in this thing, throughout her whole upbringing, and things like in school they wouldn't teach her algebra, and the reason is because they said algebra is useless, you'll never need it. And it's like, you know what? No, that isn't true at all. A, you do need algebra, and B, you need the thinking skills that come along with learning algebra, because those same thinking skills apply to other endeavors in your life. You're learning how to think. It isn't about whether or not you need to know algebra. It's about learning how to think and learning how your world works, because the world works in part according to the rules of algebra. That's just one example, and that's why I get so upset with Minnesota in this case, because its education system deprives its students of knowing just about anything they need to know to be a competent adult. I mean, they make great slaves, they make great employees, they make great NPR-toting, arrogant, pompous, pretentious windbags, but they don't actually do anything. They don't know anything. And in fact, for that very reason, they're counterproductive, because people who do know something about the world have to fight their way past these clowns before they can do anything that matters in the world. That's exactly what Scientology is doing to their children. Trying to make sure that their children only know L. Ron Hubbard. That's the only thing they know. The whole world is L. Ron Hubbard. So why isn't Amy Klobuchar and Al Franken taking Scientology down instead of granting them tax-exempt status as a religion? You tell me. Personally, I think it's because they're Minnesotans. They don't care. They open their mouths and say, the children, the children, the children, the children, all day long. But when push comes to shove, what do they do about it? Nothing. End of story. The proof is not in their words, it's in their behavior. One of the other things I mentioned in the first video, I alluded to the civil process and how Scientology prohibits its members from engaging in the civil process, using the civil courts, calling the police, especially if they're dealing with another Scientologist. And I didn't really flesh that out very much. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I just wanted to point out that when I played those videos, I really wanted to apply that to my experience in Meannesota. With my neighbors violated their lease. Section B7 in our lease prohibited that kind of noise and harassment. The landlord refused to enforce that lease, a legal contract which we signed, in which he wrote that clause into his own lease, and yet he wouldn't enforce it on my behalf. The police had city ordinances prohibiting noise. Though you'll find those on my website. They read as if they were written specifically for my situation. The police just refused to do anything about it. The city couldn't have cared less. All the way up to the very top. Recently, when I sent that extremely important letter to the Attorney General and the Governor of Minnesota, I got back one form letter and a complete non-response from the Attorney General. So what they're doing is they're basically, even though I have all of these legal rights as a citizen, they are depriving me of any civil process. You know, I'm not a millionaire, so I can't afford to go outside of Minnesota and find an attorney who's willing to do battle against the system that he's a part of. See, all the Minnesota attorneys I've gone to are a part of the sick and twisted Minnesota legal system. So I only have to talk to them for a few minutes. Once they realize that my problem is with the government and is with this whole system that they're a part of, they shut me down and they send me away and they say, well, there's nothing you can do. Now, that's not what a competent attorney does. A competent attorney would look at this and say, well, you know, it sounds like you've got a really strong case and you've done a great job of gathering evidence. Tell me more. I want to hear some more, and then I'll let you know my opinion. They don't do that. I can spend as little as 30 seconds or as much as 5 minutes explaining things to these attorneys, and they'll send me packing. Then it's because they're not going to go up against their own cult. They can't. They're not going to file suit against other members of the sick and twisted Minnesota legal system. But what that does is it deprives me of any civil process. I have every legal right to it, but in practice, I can't get it. So I have no legal remedy. I should be able to sue my landlord without any doubt. I mean, there's he broke a contract, and the consequences, the devastating consequences of his failure and his ruthlessness is more than evident. I've lost everything I have, and I'm living in a car. I mean, if there was ever a case that's clear cut, that is it. But I don't have access to that remedy. Same thing with my neighbors. They were engaged in harassment. I should be able to file civil suits against them, but I can't. I don't have the money, and there's no process. There's no remedy for me. All the way up to when I just asked the Attorney General and the Governor for the ultimate legal remedy. And they don't even respond. They don't even respond while they collect a paycheck, supposedly for doing their jobs. So I just wanted to point out the fact that I have the right to a legal remedy, but I don't have a legal remedy. I'm deprived of that right by the cult of Meannesota. And it's the same thing that happens in Scientology. Those people have a legal right as American citizens to the civil process, to legal remedies, but they are deprived of it deliberately. So again, there's another flat-out comparison between Meannesota and Scientology. I have never experienced that in any other state I've lived in. Now with that, let's get started on video 2 here in earnest. I'm going to start out, though, by replaying a clip I played toward the end of part 1 of this video, because I want to reiterate this. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but just the most relevant part about how Scientology implements what it calls ethics, and specifically how it deals with suppressives, or SPs, or outsiders, and in particular critics. Just take a look at this video again to remind yourself of what we're dealing with here in Scientology.
About 3 years ago, Hubbard introduced a new note into his little kingdom, discipline. He laid down a rigid line of conduct. Since then, the ethics department has taken over more and more. This is one of Hubbard's ethics orders on critics of Scientology, so-called suppressives.
SP order, fair game, may be deprived of property or injured by any means by any Scientologist without any discipline of the Scientologist, may be tricked, sued or lied to or destroyed.
Last year, Hubbard wrote,
Now get this as a technical fact, not a hopeful idea. Every time we have investigated the background of a critic of Scientology, we have found crimes for which that person or group could be imprisoned under existing law. We do not find critics of Scientology who do not have criminal pasts. Over and over we prove this. Politician A stands up on his hind legs in a parliament and brays for a condemnation of Scientology. When we look him over, we find crimes, embezzled funds, moral lapses, a thirst for young boys, sordid stuff. Wife B howls at her husband for attending a Scientology group. We look her up and find she had a baby he didn't know about.
Most recently, Hubbard wrote this of a group of people who defended against the ethics department.
They are declared enemies of mankind, the planet, and all life. They are fair game. No amnesty may ever cover them. The Criminals Prosecution Bureau is to find any and all crimes in their pasts and have them brought to court and prison. Any C organization member contacting any of them is to use auditing process R245.
Hubbard calls R245 an enormously effective process of exteriorization frowned upon by society at...
Or hypnoheliostatic stasis with X4. If you listen to part 1 of this video, you will know what that means, and you will get that reference. In any cult, you want to dissociate the people in the cult from the rest of the world. You want to separate them. And you have to create an us and them attitude in various ways. One way is to portray anyone who's outside the group as inherently either inferior or a threat or an enemy, or in this case what Hubbard calls suppressives. And he's making up this language, what is it, R245 or whatever the hell that was, and he comes up with all these terms, overt and withhold, and the reason you come up with that slang and that terminology is because as you become more immersed in the cult, you obviously start using that slang. You've dealt with people. Just go talk to someone in a profession. They have their own slang and language that they have to use to communicate ideas that are relevant to their industry. And at some point you lose sight of what they're talking about, and to the extent that they talk about that stuff, you really don't want to be around them because you don't know what they're talking about. It's boring, right? It keeps you at bay. Well, that's what cults do. They create their own esoteric language and their terms and their slang so that when you go out into the real world, they can't communicate with normal people anymore because they're using all this language that has no meaning to normal, sane people. Now, Scientology, of course, is a proselytizing church. It seeks to bring people into the cult. But the instant they realize that you're not going to go for it, which is most of the time, you're declared an SP. And that means you are an enemy, an outsider, a threat, inferior, etc. And according to this fair game so-called ethics of L. Ron Hubbard, they are to be lied to, tricked, which means deceived. If you listen to my last video where I talked about my former Meannesota employer, my landlord, the police, everyone, frankly, everyone in Meannesota, deception is one of the foundations of how Meannesota operates, such that you don't know what you're dealing with because you can't rely on anything anybody says. All the way up to, according to fair game, all the way up to being destroyed. And that is where people give the most attention to fair game, is their idea that Scientology wants to absolutely destroy outsiders. Now, they don't have the resources to do it. They portray themselves as having millions of followers, and even if they did, who cares? There's 7 billion people in the world. If you know basic arithmetic, you can figure out that's just a trivial number of people anyway. But the fact is, the most reliable numbers place the membership of Scientology more around 30,000 people worldwide. And they, other than their ability to intimidate people and to abuse the legal system, they not only have no threat, but one day they're going to push the wrong person too far and they're going to get shut down. They're just going to get annihilated. And we all look forward to that day, and they will bring it upon themselves because they keep going out and attacking outsiders, and they're going to mess with the wrong person at some point. And then they're done for, and they're legal sharks, the people who go out sending these threatening letters, they're gonna learn what it means to have a friend in prison, and they're gonna, shall we say, they're gonna be caught with their pants down, you might say. And we all look forward to that day. Unfortunately, Meannesota, the nature of that cult, that isn't going to happen in Meannesota. Because you're dealing, now there could be individuals, there are individuals who should be prosecuted for crimes, but as a cult, that really isn't going to happen because it's an organic, natural cult that arose out of tribal mentalities. And, other than those relatively few criminals who should be prosecuted and imprisoned, when it comes to Meannesota, I'm more worried about trying to raise a generation of competent Minnesotans so that Meannesota just disappears. Because those people deserve to have a life worth living. They deserve to be normal. They deserve to interact with the world the way that everyone else in the world is capable of interacting, and to enjoy the fellowship of humanity instead of going through their whole lives with this us and them attitude where everyone outside of Meannesota is to be shunned or exploited or enslaved or used and abused and, if necessary, destroyed. But when it comes to Scientology, here with this fair game ethics plan, you see where Hubbard says you will destroy these people, and that's exactly what they try to do. They went on to talk about what I was saying earlier about trying to gather dirt on people. Now, any literate person who hears that is just going to say this is insanity, right? Wife A had a baby that her husband doesn't know about. Yeah, there's people out there who have things in their lives. They have secrets and such. But what they're portraying is the fact that you're an SP, period. Nothing else. That one fact alone, which they arbitrarily declare, means that you must have some horrible, terrible thing in your background. Now, what you're going to see in upcoming clips about Scientology ethics is where they start to flesh out the manner in which they accomplish what I spoke about a few moments ago, which is where, since most people do not have those kinds of deep, dark secrets, most people are not criminals, Scientology has to use rhetoric and propaganda, manipulate language in order to take ordinary information about these people and present them in a way like that Mad Magazine campaign smear speech did, right? So your mother's a proselyte in a church. Meh. Well, yeah, if you're talking to someone who doesn't know what a proselyte is, you might get away with that, and they might think less of the candidate and his mother. And that's another reason you don't want a terribly well-educated and literate population within a cult. Cults generally shun education, or they control education. They make sure that their followers do not have the critical thinking skills, mainly because critical thinking skills are the fastest way out of the cult, because they're just going to notice what they're immersed in and they're going to start clawing their way out of it. But also because when you control their education, you lead them in exactly the direction you want to go. Anyway, back to Scientology, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with an esoteric language, you're dealing with restricting education, and so that Scientologists lose sight of the full package of tools that they once had to interpret reality correctly, which is my definition of a cult. Now, as I talk about Meannesota here going forward, it's going to be a little bit tough because Meannesota, again, is very organic. It isn't an established, rigid thing. It has rigid aspects to it, like its legal system and its education system. But, in general, the place where I encountered this the most obviously was in my workplace with my former Meannesota employer. But as I said, because of certain unethical corruptions, shall we say, I can't tell you about my former Meannesota employer, and I can't even tell you why I can't tell you about my former Meannesota employer. Now I'm going to tell you what I can, and upon, my demise, that information will come out, naming names and doing all the stuff that really needs to be out there. But for now, I'm going to tell you what you need to know in relation to Scientology. When it comes to fair game and this idea of utterly destroying people, first and foremost, let's start at the beginning. I'm sitting in a car. I'm sitting in the driver's seat of a car, and it's a two-seater to begin with. So I'm in a very, very small car, and I'm in a very small front seat, boxed in on one side by this door, boxed in on the other side by this stick shift column. In the front, I have a steering wheel and a windshield. In my back, I have a seat that just isn't that comfortable for sitting in for 3 months straight. That's where I'm making these videos, with a laptop on my lap and a trackpad. The reason you're not getting a professional production here is because I no longer have the studio that I worked so hard and honestly to earn, and I had built, and I never once got to use. I have been utterly destroyed. I can barely move my legs. I have no strength. My body is destroyed. I have been destroyed by Meannesota. That doesn't happen in a normal culture. Not as the result of a simple problem of neighbor noise. Only in some bizarre, totally out of touch with reality culture is something like that going to happen. So just my current existence verifies the fact that Meannesota has a tendency toward utter destruction. And like I said, they have made moves like Scientology where they would love it if I just committed suicide. If that happened, they would never have another complaint. I would never be asking them to do the job they're paid to do, and they can just continue collecting their paycheck without the burden of people asking them to do their jobs in exchange for that paycheck. My former Meannesota employer would be able to continue going on without worrying that I'm just going to go ahead and tell the world about them anyway. All these people who do so much evil, and I mean evil, would feel so much better if I disappeared from the face of the earth. That is not a normal society. Okay, a competent normal society would want the evil that I know about to be exposed, prosecuted, and annihilated, because they don't want that evil in their society. They want to be happy. They want to enjoy their lives. They don't want those kinds of threats around them. But in Meannesota, no. All the energy goes into destroying the person who would expose and otherwise get rid of all that evil. That's the sign of a cult. That's exactly what Scientology is doing here with its fair game so-called ethics directives. Let's start looking at clips from this one interview. The person being interviewed is named Jefferson Hawkins. He's the author of a book called Closing Minds: How Scientology's Ethics Technology is Used to Control Their Members. Jefferson Hawkins, I'm not going to play this clip where he tells his credentials, but he was in publishing. One of the things he did was he was responsible for the massive television ad campaign for the book Dianetics, L. Ron Hubbard's book that started Scientology. I remember that campaign from the 80s, and I edited it out from the first video in this series where I talked about my experience observing those ads, because back then America had a manufacturing base. America still had strength. We had television ads for refrigerators and automobiles and just all kinds of things. And nowadays all the ads are for pharmaceuticals to self-medicate yourself with drugs and 900 numbers and crap like that. But when I was young, all the ads on television were for products. They were for things. They were for manufactured goods and very few services. And so it was strange when these ads started coming out for Dianetics and the Book of Mormon. Those were the only time you saw advertisements for books, really, was the Book of Mormon and Dianetics. In other words, cults that are trying to use marketing tactics to proselytize, to bring people into the cult. Jefferson Hawkins apparently was the guy, or one of the top guys, who was behind that ad campaign, and it was very effective. All right, so this interview with Jefferson Hawkins is specifically about ethics in Scientology, and I have a lot of clips here. Shy of playing you the whole interview, I'll put the interview in my not show notes, in the description to this video so that you can listen to the entire interview. But it's very good because they make a very good progression from start to finish. Let me just play the first clip for you now, and keep in mind as you listen to this things that happen in an oppressive environment that are meant to keep people from stepping out and showing any kind of independent thought or individuality or creativity, anything that might interfere with the power structure. An oppressive structure tells you things like, you have to toe the line, and, don't question authority, and, don't rock the boat. You have to go along to get along. And these are quotes straight out of my workplace for my former Meannesota employer, but the sentiments are pervasive throughout all of Meannesota. So listen to this clip and just get the first taste of how this is exactly the same thing that goes on in Scientology ethics.
Yeah, and what you wrote about in those series of posts, you discussed the topic of Scientology ethics. Now, that word out here in the non-Scientology world means something different than it does in the Church of Scientology. Jeff, what does ethics mean in the Church of Scientology?
As I went through and wrote these articles, I based it on the book Introduction to Scientology Ethics. And as I went through and analyzed each chapter of that book, I came to have quite a different view of what ethics means in Scientology. And really, it means doing what you're told, or doing what will benefit the church. And if a Scientologist tries to color outside the lines, or step over the boundaries, or begins to doubt what they're doing in Scientology, or questions church management, anything like that, they're sent to ethics. So you rapidly get the idea of what they're doing here. They're really corralling in people and trying to get them to toe the line and not to rebel, not to question, not to doubt, because if they do, they will run into ethics. So in terms of Scientology, they have a term, in ethics. A person is in ethics if they are doing what the church wants them to do, forwarding the church's purposes, contributing money, taking their courses, and all that. If a person's doing those things, they're considered to be in ethics. And if they are not doing what they're told, If they are questioning management or questioning decisions that are being made, or if they're doubting Scientology, then they're considered to be out ethics. So that's really the purpose of it. If they start to question things, the first thing they'll do, of course, is they'll say, well, you have a misunderstood word or this or that. But if the person has too many disagreements, they'll end up with the ethics officer. And this is probably one of the early times when they'll start to encounter ethics, is if they question things, if they ask too many questions, if they are asking questions about Hubbard, if they're sort of doubting what the materials say, and if the word clearing methods don't get them into line, they will end up with the ethics officer. So the public Scientologist pretty rapidly gets the idea that they don't make waves. They don't make waves, they don't question what they're being told.
All right, so with this first clip, you get a general view of Scientology ethics, and I've already really mentioned much of this. What Mr. Hawkins is talking about is that once he got out of Scientology and looked at it objectively, he felt that it had a, quote, different view of things than what would traditionally be called ethics. In Scientology, ethics is directly tied to doing what you're told, doing what benefits the cult in question. Anyone who doubts is sent to ethics, and we'll see what that means shortly. Ethics in Scientology means, as he said, corralling in people, towing the line, not rebelling, not questioning. In Scientology, you're, quote, in ethics if you follow, obey, and believe. In Scientology, you are, quote, out of ethics if you act independently, disobey, or disbelieve. In other words, if you exhibit the qualities and characteristics that make you a human being. So you can see where this is going. In Scientology, ethics is a cult-building tactic. Now in Meannesota, this, like I said, was pervasive. There's no ethics department as such. There's no individual who's laying down the law as an enforcer, like Karen said in the last part one of this video. Karen said that ethics officers were enforcers. And that's why it's hard for me to get away from my former Meannesota employer. That's the most obvious place that this took place. Literally, enforcers in the sense of if you step outside the box, if you do the right thing, if you do something that, say, a stockholder would want you to do because their investment is at stake, versus doing what local, regional Meannesota management wants you to do because the only thing they're concerned with is their own careers, their own asses, their own interests. They're not acting as stewards of the company in the way that they're supposed to, which is to be stewards of the stockholders' investments. If you challenge anything that they're doing at that level, especially if you challenge gross misconduct, in other words, do exactly what a shareholder would want you to do. That's what I would want an employee to do. If I had shares in a company and management is totally screwing everything up, I would want someone to bring it up, bring it to the forefront. In my employer, literally an enforcer walked in, and this one wore high heels, and unfortunately for her, she didn't seem to realize that I had studied this stuff for decades, so she expected her standard manipulative nonsense to work on me, and it did not, which only pissed them off further. However, in other cases, I had a coworker who was brought to tears by this person, and by all accounts, this person thoroughly enjoyed watching my coworker being brought to tears in the sadistic sense. So that, it isn't funny at all, to be honest, when you dig into it. It's sick and twisted, it's deranged, it's degenerate, it's evil. In Meannesota at large, you have the same thing, but it's hard to enforce it because, again, there is no written ethics policy. There is no, it's something that you're raised with, but the thing is, that's what makes it a cult. It's the fact that these people within this certain geographic area, not everybody, but the people who I would call a Minnesotan all have the same sense of ethics. Tells you that there's a similarity there and that it arose out of their culture. The problem is their sense of ethics is very similar to Scientology. You do not question things. You look at outsiders with immediate suspicion. You fear outsiders. If they get in your way, you punish them up to and including destroying them. This is the ethics of Meannesota. This is not an ethical system that a normal, stable, sane, and rational society exhibits. Okay, this is the kind of thing that a Soviet Union, a truly oppressive society, would demonstrate. So I'm not going to say any more on this particular clip because we have so much more coming, but you can just see there's a big difference between what Meannesota and Scientology call ethics versus what sane and rational humanity calls ethics. With that, let's go on to the next clip.
Normally, the first thing that happens when a person comes into Scientology, one of the first courses they take has to do with, and I'm not sure what they call it now, but it's the causes of suppression and all about suppressive people. And that's a very, very basic course, and it's one of the first ones that a person takes after they have maybe taken an introductory course. And the idea is they really want to get across to them this idea that there are suppressive people, and anyone criticizing the church is a suppressive person, and you don't want to associate with those people. And this starts to sort of set up the bubble. Yeah, one of the first things that a new person runs across is if their friends or family start to criticize Scientology, is just to kind of, if they don't disconnect right away, they kind of shut them out or shut them up and tell them don't talk about that. So that starts to get this whole idea of ethics into play.
Now, in that clip, Jefferson was talking about Scientology's tendency to early on, when you enter Scientology, to try to distance you from people who are outside of the group, even before you know what the group's about. One of the first courses you have to take is about so-called suppressives. Now, it's framed as if you're learning something. You know, oh boy, I'm here finally learning about Scientology, and what is the first thing I learn? I learned that other people are a danger to me. Only my new friends here in Scientology are good for me. That's what this course essentially teaches. And you see where eventually this whole concept of suppressives or SPs or outsiders goes, all the way up to destroying them. Now the question is the typical person who joins Scientology inclined toward utterly destroying another human being, possibly even killing that other person? Are all the 30,000 people who join Scientology, are they inclined that way when they first sit down in the chair? Or is that something that they are infused with within Scientology? And the answer is the latter. And it's because of courses like this. It's because they become immersed in this subculture that keeps telling them outsiders are a threat, are a danger, we are your friends. And as he alludes to there, that even includes your family. You'll see a concept coming up about detachment, dissociation from your own family. You prefer to be with Scientologists over your own child, for example. Something's dreadfully wrong when that happens, I hope you realize. Well, in Meannesota, again, as an organic cult, it's not as cut and dried, but the fact is I have watched kids be born and raised, and I can tell you that based on their parents' behavior, which is where they learn a lot of what they know about the world, I can't tell you what they're saying behind closed doors to raise their children. What I can tell you is from talking to the parents and observing how the parents behave, which is what the children are going to pick up on, their behavior is one of outsiders are a threat. Outsiders are suspicious, at the very least suspicious. New people I will treat with kid gloves. It's never just with open arms meet a stranger and see where it goes. It's never that. That requires risk and courage and a sense of adventure, a true love of humanity, all the diverse types of people out there. You don't get that with Minnesotans. They approach every new person exactly the same. and they regard them with suspicion and as a potential threat immediately. Obviously, they're passing that on to their children. That's why each generation of Minnesotans behaves that way. So you could say that the first course that a Minnesota child gets is just like Jefferson described. Only it's not a course, it's just the first life experience they get by observing their parents. And of course, their parents are going to tell them things. And since Minnesota is a very liberal or leftist state, that includes things like stranger danger, anybody with a gun is evil, watch out for that van driving by, it's probably a child molester, they're going to kidnap you. It's one thing to be prudent, and I understand that. Now, I'll say right off the bat, I don't have children, so I am speaking a bit out of turn here. And I'm not saying if I had children I would let them run wild. That's not the case. But I would not want them to grow up with an irrational fear of strangers at the expense of them growing up with a real love of embracing other people. Because ultimately, you're always at risk of danger, but whether or not you have that enjoyment of life, of interacting with all these different diverse types of people out there, that's really up to you and your upbringing. Minnesotans cut that off. They just strangle it almost from birth. It's us and them, that kind of attitude. And that's what Jefferson's talking about here. Of course, he also said a lot of things, again, that are related to my former Minnesota employer. To understand why I talk about my employer, why it's so relevant, it isn't because, I got screwed over by my employer, so here's a chance to talk about it. It's true I got screwed over by him, and it is a chance to talk about it. What makes them unique, though, is that I learned a lot about Minnesota from that company, and the reason is because when I first started, it was managed by outsiders. And when I say outsiders, I mean across the globe. By the time I left, it had been largely taken over by Minnesotans, the real deal, people from here. And those people from elsewhere in the world were largely gone. So I got to watch the transition of how a company, and corporations are never a healthy thing, but I got to watch the transition of how a corporation functions under leadership of people who are somewhat sane, somewhat stable, and were raised with some kind of knowledge and appreciation of the world at large, versus when these Minnesotans took over and it became very oppressive. It became very much an us and them, this kind of ethics, ethics officers walking around watching you, having people spy on each other. That kind of stuff came with the Minnesotans. That did not come with it started to infiltrate with the people from outside. Again, that's the corporate culture. But where it really took hold was when Minnesotans took over. So that's the reason I'm talking about my employer so much, is it was just a clear evidence of, it was like a micro, well, not even a microcosm. I saw it over the 7 years. It paralleled exactly what my experience was, having spent 40 years in the real world and then moving to Minnesota and having to figure out what is going on. Why do these people behave so bizarre? It was kind of a microcosm of that over the 7 years that I was in Minnesota, that I observed this rapid change and drastic change at my former Minnesota employer. And by the end of it, the inhumanity was so unbelievable. I mean, if you look at it from the outside, you would say, this is, it may or may not be criminal, but it's so wrong that people should just be getting thrown out when they treat their coworkers this badly. I mean, this is just horrific. This is horrifying. And there wasn't, nobody even got upset by this stuff. Even when something like when I was laid off and just suddenly disappeared. And I served, over 100 people around the world very closely. And they're not even upset. I mean, the only people who tried to find me were from outside of the country. So, not from Minnesota. It's the mentality of Minnesota was at my former employer. Anyway, I don't want to harp on that, but that's why I keep bringing them up, because the transition from relative outsiders running this company to pure Minnesotans running it was just an exponential growth in evil. and inhumanity and gross misconduct, just irrational behavior. And interestingly enough, at the same time, they moved farther and farther and farther away from what I would want them to do as a shareholder in the company, watching after my interests as a good steward. And that's significant, because what it basically means is they're infiltrating a company and taking it over for their own purposes only. And guess what? Isn't that just what I said Scientology did, with the largest infiltration of the United States government in American history? They took over these institutions, they got their people in there, and they started maneuvering them for their own purposes. And with that, let's move on to the next clip.
Now, this is fundamental to the Church of Scientology, the confession of your overts, transgressions, withholds. This slowly begins to give the church power over you. They've cut off your friends, and now you're confessing to them the thoughts you have. What is a typical example of a doubt a new Scientologist might have that has to be handled in ethics?
Normally, a new person will, when they first get into Scientology, they'll still be connected to their family, to their friends, and they'll still have access to the internet. And they haven't been taught yet not to read stuff that's critical of Scientology on the internet. So probably the first thing happens is, they go home and they talk to their family or their friends, and they say, why, you're involved in that crazy cult of Scientology, and haven't you read this, and haven't you seen this? They run up against that confusion pretty quickly. And so if they go into the org and they say, well, I heard this, and I heard this, and I heard this, bang, then they'll get into the to the ethics officer and be raked over the coals, and that's when you start to get into okay, well, what are your crimes? What have you done that you are so critical of the church, and so forth.
Okay, if you have followed my work on Meannesota.com and here on YouTube, you probably already know what I'm going to say next. In that sense, this last clip that you heard serves kind of as a midterm exam for people trying to learn about Meannesota. What the interviewer started out talking about was terms like overt and withhold transgressions. These are, jingo lingo slang that L. Ron Hubbard came up with, like, suppressive and those other terms. He came up with those to describe what psychology and psychiatry would call things like repression, subconscious. And the irony of it all is that, as we said in the last video, Scientology hates psychiatry. It thinks it's a total fraud, it's just garbage, it's junk. And in that one interview, the black and white interview, later on, L. Ron Hubbard said, when they asked him, does Scientology have anything to do with psychology? Hubbard goes, no. Scientology has nothing to do with psychiatry. That's bad manners to even suggest such a thing. Okay, that's what Hubbard had to say about it. And yet, he came up with his own big toolbox full of psychological psychobabble, like overt and withhold and stuff like that. That's what he's talking about here. So, this is where you're repressing this memory of this trauma in your childhood, and all these overts and withholds. That's what they're talking about. But the other thing he mentioned was confession. Now, aside from the fact that confession in Scientology is something that is recorded and written down and put in your file for future use against you later, and it will be, keep in mind that the concept of confession here is not like in the religious sense. In the religious sense, you are confessing a sin against God. And Scientology is not a religion. It has no God, it has no prayer, it has nothing of the kind. In Scientology, confession is where you're basically brought down and humiliated to where you admit all of those things that are in your heart and in your mind that you really just don't want other people to know. And that's the way it is for everybody. Every person walking this earth walks around with sources of shame and regret and things they wish they hadn't done. It's just the way it is. That's part of the human experience, right? In Scientology, those things are pulled out of Scientologists, supposedly so that they can be analyzed and to help them, which, oddly enough, sounds a hell of a lot like psychiatry, doesn't it? Whoops, I'm not supposed to say that. Shh, don't tell anybody. But what it really is, more than anything, is a way to gather dirt on the Scientologists, because again, it goes into their files, can be used against them later. Here's the thing, though. When you listen to this clip, they are talking about this in the context of when you start to question or doubt Scientology. So someone joins Scientology and they haven't thrown away their family and their life yet, and all their money, of course. They haven't lost all that stuff yet, so they're still kind of living in this limbo between the real world and L. Ron Hubbard's fantasy land. So they see a book or they get on the internet and they see people saying Scientology is a batshit crazy cult. So they go back to Scientology and they say, well, I saw on the internet that this is a batshit crazy cult. And Scientologists, what do? Do you recognize what they do? This is where the midterm exam comes in. In fact, I'm going to reach down here in my car. I happen to have a couple of drumsticks, and I'm going to do a drum roll because this is that important, folks. When you go to somebody with a legitimate question or a legitimate complaint, and they turn around and they direct the conversation about you instead, what is that called? Blaming the victim. One of the foundations of Meannesota is that they instinctively, it comes right out of them naturally. They blame the victim when somebody who has suffered a legitimate abuse or been victimized by a crime or been traumatized or been hurt and harmed, when they bring that up in Meannesota, the first thing out of a Minnesotan's mouth is to blame the victim. And how do they do it? They don't ask you what happened in this particular instance. They ask you, well, why didn't you whatever, or why did you whatever. They're asking you questions about you. They're trying to turn it around on you. That's exactly what these ex-Scientologists are discussing right here. Okay, there's what they call confession is basically other Scientologists asking a bunch of leading questions, trying to get you to explain how this is somehow your fault. What, you read something about Scientology being a batshit crazy cult? Well, what have you been doing that makes you want to look for something like that? Huh? What have you been? What? You know, I'm starting to get a little nervous having you here. Are you sure? Are you sure you're one of us, or it sounds to me like you're maybe an SP. That wouldn't be the case, would it? Because don't forget, if you're an SP, you can have your life destroyed. This last clip I played is an incredible summary of what the fundamental problem is, both with Scientology and Meannesota. Once you're in it at all, you can get abused, you can get pummeled. You can have one injustice happen to you after another. And the first response out of their mouths when you bring it up is, well, what did you do to make this happen? What, you got raped? What were you wearing? What, you were in 9/11 and the building collapsed around you and you died and you left your family without a father and a husband? Why did you go into that building? I mean, it was bombed in 1993. You knew it was a target. Why did you go into that building? Don't you love your children and your wife? Is that the problem? See, this is what they do. This is what Scientology and Meannesota both do. The first thing out of everyone's mouth in my situation was, well, why don't you just move away? Or why didn't you just move away? Why didn't you just move away? Somehow, moving away is supposed to explain why other people are yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs at 3 in the morning, why the person above me is dropping a bowling ball, why the person diagonal above me sounds like they're cooking meth every third day, why the person next to me is slamming doors as hard and loud as they possibly can several times each day, and leaving their car outside my bedroom window going boom, 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 boom. Somehow, something that I did is responsible for that behavior. Okay, now if everything I said before hasn't already made the point that blaming the victim is one of the core characteristics of Meannesota, I hope this helps get it across by comparing it to what they do in Scientology. Now, the other thing I need to point out here is that normal, stable, rational, humane, decent societies don't do that. They don't go up to the rape victim and say, "What were you wearing?" They don't do that. Meannesota does, instinctively. But normal people don't do that. Humane people don't do that. Scientology would. Meannesota does. Blaming the victim, I have a bunch of clips on blaming the victim. It's actually a topic of abnormal psychology. It is so just repugnant and morally wrong. It is so filthy and foul and degenerate that when you have a culture that instinctively resorts to blaming the victim, just the first thing they think of, something's wrong. That's not a normal society. That is not a society that interacts with other human beings in a normal social fashion. Again, that's the kind of thing that a sociopath or a psychopath would do. Certainly something that somebody with no empathy would do. And empathy is the beginning of humanity. Sociopaths lack empathy. Psychopaths lack empathy. So when you have something that inherently is antithetical to empathy, like blaming the victim, and that's the instinctive response for a group or a culture, something is wrong. Something is really, really wrong with these people. And yet, throughout my experience, that's all I've gotten. Why didn't you do this? Why did you do that? A bunch of leading questions that are looking to get me to what Scientology would call confess. That somehow this is my fault. That somehow other people's behavior, other people's violent attacks against me, or other people accepting a paycheck while refusing to do their job in the service of me, which is their job, all of that stuff that these other people are doing wrong is somehow my fault. And that's what they do with these Scientologists once they start questioning anything, once they start raising issues, once they start trying to get people to think. They turn it all around. It kind of goes back to that never defend, always attack strategy of L. Ron Hubbard's. And remember, the reason that he has that strategy in a military science sense is because his position is indefensible. He can't defend it. It's just total nonsense. So you go on the attack. That's what all these things are. That's what blaming the victim is. That's what asking all these what, why, who, where, when questions are. Now, if you're a journalist, okay, I kind of understand. You have to go in there and you have to check out all the angles and see what's going on. But there's some questions that just don't need to be asked. For example, when you're being tortured and tormented inside your own home by people who are breaking a clearly defined law, and law enforcement is driving around in these cute little black and white clown cars all the time, you don't ask the question, why didn't you move? You ask the question, well, why didn't all these cops in these little clown cars arrest the people who are breaking the law? That's the question you ask. But Minnesotans don't do that. They don't even think that way. They're not even wired to think that way. Because if you bring up something that seems to be causing trouble, that makes them feel uncomfortable, and anything that remotely resembles conflict to them is trouble. That's another feature of Meannesota, is that they hate conflict. They run away from conflict every chance they get. Like I said, they prefer to work from the shadows, snipe from the trees. They're gonna hurt you off camera. They're not gonna look you in the face and hurt you. Okay, so they avoid conflict at all costs. So if you bring up something that sounds like you're talking about a conflict, they don't want to hear it, and they're going to try to shut you down by blaming you. That's exactly what Scientology is doing here. And yet, this is all done under the banner of ethics. Something is dreadfully wrong, folks. Let's move on to the next clip.
One thing Hubbard really emphasized is the group. A Scientologist, he or she wants to be a member of the group, and you must be a member of the Church of Scientology in good standing. What does it mean to be in good standing with the Church of Scientology or a part of the group?
This is where we get into conditions, because there is a condition of liability. Anybody who's been in the church gets familiar with these things. And these are supposedly natural states that Hubbard discovered, and these kind of rote formulas to get out of this, whatever the state was. And as you supposedly go down these levels, you get to something called liability, where the person becomes a liability to the group. At that point, they are no longer considered to be a member of the group, and they have to go through steps, which includes making up the damage and petitioning all the members of the group to allow to be rejoined. Well, this is what Steve Hassan calls dispensing of existence, where your very existence in the group can be granted or withheld. And the same with disconnection, the same with being declared PTS. A person who's declared PTS can't take services anymore, so they've been excluded from the group. So there are these various mechanisms that communicate to the person, you are no longer in this group. You no longer have any existence in the group, and then the person has to then take steps and petition and do all of these things to be granted approval to get back into the group. And that's a very powerful tool.
And of course, the reason why it's such a powerful tool is because humans are members of a social species, a tribal species. For most people, the threat of being cast out of the group is terrifying. The threat of having the group no longer like you is terrifying. And we all know from experience, going all the way back to grade school and high school, where you're playing dodgeball. You know, pick me, pick me. You know, if you're the last one picked, you feel like dirt, because it means, you're right, it means nobody wants you, or at least nobody wants you on your team. You can be the most popular skinny kid in the world and be picked one of the first picks on your dodgeball team. You don't have to be Mr. Big Buff. So that is just a common weapon that everyone's familiar with. And the thing is, I could go on for a couple hours just talking about how the group as a weapon is used by both Scientology and Meannesota. And I don't want to get bogged down on this one, because most people have enough experience, personal experience with this, that they kind of understand what's going on. Let me just point out, though, that when I gave my definition of a cult, where I said a cult is anytime that you abdicate all of the skills that you have for interpreting reality correctly in favor of some prepackaged answers or a guru who claims to have all the answers. When I said that, I left out one thing I didn't mention. The other side of that is that you have to picture every human being has a bunch of social circles. And I actually visualize these circles. You have a circle around yourself, a circle around you and your parents, a circle around you and your whole family, a circle around you and your friends, a circle around you and your coworkers. You know what I mean. And for some people, this can extend all the way to the circle that surrounds everybody on Earth, if you're all one world lovey-dovey types. Now the thing is, each of these circles is actually a wall. It's a wall that's separating these social circles. And some of these walls are made of brick and mortar, some of them are made of sand, some are made of paper mache, some are made of iron. And some of them have moats around them, some of them have many gates that are freely open, others have a few gates that are opened on occasion, some might have no gates. That's one individual. There's 7 billion people on planet Earth. Each one of them is walking around with all these circles around them. You know, if you can visualize them. How those circles interact with each other helps to explain, ultimately, almost everything you see on the geopolitical stage. When you get into warfare and geopolitics, those circles really ultimately are what help you explain what's going on with all of that. when you get into something like Scientology, as they just said, the first thing they do is try to make you think that everyone outside Scientology is different. They're an enemy. They're an SP, a suppressive. Then they try to take away your family and try to push your friends away. What they're doing is they're trying to knock down all those walls. They're trying to destroy every one of those circles in your life. And that leaves nothing. And that's terrifying for a human being, a social animal. Then they replace it with their walls, which is really one wall, and you might think of it as two. One wall might be the individual Scientologist and what you might call the approval of L. Ron Hubbard. Now, Hubbard's dead, so you're not getting his approval, but you know what I mean by that, right? You want the approval of your guru, whether he's dead or not. But the main circle, of course, is just the circle of all of Scientologists, all those people who are not suppressives. So they've annihilated all these circles you've built up over the years and replaced it with nothing but really just this one in Scientology. The threat of losing that is horrific. That's the equivalent of someone else losing all of their circles at one time. That's a terribly powerful manipulative weapon against people, the threat of losing that. Okay, so I think you understand what's going on there. Meannesota is more difficult to explain. You have to understand, Minnesotans are born and raised to believe that they are the center of the universe, such that all those other people out there only exist to serve them in some capacity. Now, they might serve them as a waiter at the restaurant, they might serve them as a form of a slave, or they might serve them as their spouse. Whatever. But the point is, they're totally narcissistic. They're raised to be that way. Their circles exist just like anybody else, and some of them even have, they think they have this lovey-dovey, I love the world attitude, and they have a circle that goes around the whole world. The difference is, what are those circles made out of in a Minnesotan versus a normal person? Now, a normal person, of course, is going to have stronger walls around the people who are closest to them, their family, their close friends, and the walls generally get weaker as you go out. But the thing is, the walls to your family, for example, for most people, they're not closed, they're not shut. If somebody marries your sister, the fact that they married your sister makes them kin, makes them special to you, and makes their family special to you. You see what I mean? Someone who comes along and wants to have a relationship with you, wants to date you, you bring them into your circle of your friends or your circle of your love interests or what have you, whatever circle that is. That's perfectly natural. But with Minnesotans, those walls in that close-knit area, they're made out of solid iron. They have a moat with crocodiles in them around it. They have one gate that's heavily guarded and always shut, and it's only opened on the command of the individual, and there's machine gun nests all up top in the towers. And there's a nuclear bomb sitting outside just in case. That's the problem with Meannesota. See, when you're at the center of the universe and you're raised to only allow this in-crowd into your life, and everyone else is basically what you might call a suppressive from the day you're born, they're basically being born and raised with the attitude of a Scientologist. The difference is that they do have multiple circles, but the circles as you get out are just paper mache. They're made out of cotton candy. They're easily destroyed. I mean, you don't have to do much. You just look at these people funny and that wall's destroyed. You're out. You're gone. So that's the difference with Meannesota, and that's what I've encountered all along. And again, it would take so long to really explain this. My main concern is to show you that versus anywhere else, at least anywhere else I've been, Meannesota and Scientology are unique in the fact that they minimize the number of very strong, heavily fortified circles. And in Minnesota's case, they use it as kind of a reverse weapon. It's a carrot on a stick. Here's my circle. Do you want in? Now, remember, in fact, this is a good time to raise this issue. Charles Schulz in the Peanuts cartoons, Charlie Brown, Snoopy, he was from Minneapolis. And he wrote the Peanuts comic strip based on his experiences growing up in Minnesota. And if you've ever thought there's something kind of weird about Charlie Brown, for one thing, it doesn't have much passion. Just like Minnesotans, it's really boring. It's really bland. It's really monotonous. It's monotone. You know, Peanuts just is a boring comic strip. It's like the Family Circus or something. You know, it's not like, you know, The Simpsons or Family Guy. It is a really boring cartoon, and it's because he grew up in a really boring Minnesota. Now, Schultz himself moved to California, so apparently he wasn't real super fond of this, but of course he grew up there, so he had warm feelings about it. One of the things in the Peanuts comic strip that most people are familiar with is this recurring theme of Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown. And then Charlie Brown would run to kick it, and she'd pull it away, and he'd go flying through the air, land on his back. Not again! And, you know, he just, every single time, no matter what she said, he would believe her, and she would pull that football away. Well, Charles Schultz is describing the way Minnesotans behave with that. So, as you try to get to know Minnesotans, they will dangle this circle of theirs as a carrot on a stick. Come on in. Come on in. But once you do something they don't like, they pull the football away and you go flying through the air. That's what Charles Schultz was telling people. But just like I told you before with Mystery Science Theater, if you don't understand what's going on in Minnesota, Peanuts just looks like a really boring, dumb comic strip that has to repeat the same joke over and over and over and over again because it can't think of anything original. That's not what Schultz was doing. Schultz was trying to show you that this is what happens over and over and over again in Minnesota. So I mean, that's ultimately what that is. And think about that. When you see her pull the football away from Charlie Brown, he's basically describing the way that Minnesotans use this circle around their close-knit group as a weapon. And they will entice people to come close so that they can be used. Because remember, outsiders are meant to be used. They exist for the purpose of this narcissistic Minnesotan. And then when you're done with them, you just spit them out, throw them in the trash. Just like my former Minnesota employer. Once it was taken over by Minnesotans, they just threw me into the trash. No fanfare, no goodbye, no party, no nothing. Just walk in one day and turned around and kicked out like a football. I mean, that's totally inhumane. That's mind-bogglingly inhumane for someone who's worked somewhere for 7 years to just be sent away and never see all those people he's worked with so closely ever again. It's incredibly inhumane. But that's what Minnesotans do. And they use these social circles as a weapon. So it's not exactly like Scientology, but the basic premise is the same. They're using these circles as weapons, and they manipulate the number of circles and what these circles are built out of in order to control other people, especially to control other people's access into their inner world. And if you're not born and raised a Minnesotan, good luck getting into that inner world. The last thing I would say on this is that you'll see online people talk about, at these forums where they talk about Minnesota and the bizarre behavior out here, you will occasionally see people who say, well, you know, it took me 10 or 20 years, but I finally, you know, felt like I was accepted by these people. And, you know, you don't have to think about that terribly long before you see what's going on here. I've been here for 10 years. I'm not accepted any more than the day I arrived. Okay, Minnesotans are not going to accept you because they get to know you. That's not what they're born and programmed to do. They are programmed to use you and exploit you for their purposes and keep you at bay otherwise. And if you piss them off, to destroy you. That's what they do. So if somebody finally gets in after 10 or 20 years and they feel accepted by Minnesotans, obviously the reason is because they changed. They gave up their identity to conform to the way that Minnesotans behave. Once you do that, then as you go and meet a new Minnesotan and they try to evaluate you and they're looking at your language and your body language and all this stuff to evaluate, is this person an insider or an outsider? They can't tell anymore because you've modified your behavior to behave like them. And so they accept you as an insider. just as if you had grown up in, a town 30 miles away, but you're still a Minnesotan. They don't necessarily know the difference. So these people who say that it took them 10 or 20 years to be accepted by Minnesotans, obviously, they are the ones who changed. It wasn't, millions of Minnesotans who changed. It was them. They gave up a part of themselves to conform to this cult. And I guess if that's what you want, go for it. I don't want it. I don't want anything to do with losing who I am. I like who I am. It is all about you behave like they are to such a degree that they can't even tell that you're an outsider or you are an outsider. And the threat of throwing you outside of those walls when you're living in Minnesota and you're surrounded by this cult, such that if you're not accepted into their group, you're literally alone. You've got nothing. And don't forget, Minnesotans lie and deceive, so you don't even know what you're dealing with. You can't rely on people's words to gauge where you're at socially. It's just a terrible quagmire, and that's why all these complaints about Minnesota almost immediately jump into the social realm and the way their social interactions, their social skills, and the way that they use these carrots on a stick and the Lucy and the football thing as a weapon against people. Anyway, like I said, don't want to get bogged down on that. I could go on that for a couple hours at least. Let's just go on to the next clip.
This raises a great question. How are ethics conditions related to statistics, which are the backbone of the Church of Scientology?
Yeah, this is something that's very odd. And when I started to pick this apart in my book and analyze it, it really is odd if you think that a person's ethics or a person's ethical nature is determined by production statistics. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You would think that a person's ethics would be defined by their decisions, their choices, how they treat other people, their business dealings, whether they're honest, whether they can be depended on. You would think that those are the sorts of things that would determine a person's ethical standing. Not so in the church. In the church, it's very, very plain. The only thing that determines your ethical standing is your production statistics. In other words, what are you doing for the church? What are you producing for the church? For a staff member, it's whatever they're doing on their post. For a public, it can be how many people they're bringing in, how many student points they get, how much they contribute, how much money they send in. All of those things determine whether the church considers them upstat or downstat. And it's really not the greatest good for the greatest number of dynamics when you boil it down to its essence. It's whatever benefits the church, and what benefits the church is the statistics.
Jeff, it seems to me that this is the crux of the matter. Rather than a person being judged by their character, their behavior, they're strictly judged by what they're producing for the church.
Yes.
Because the church is denominated in money, production, what have you done for us lately? It seems that you could be in a continual state of crisis, doubt, despair, fear, depending on your ethics condition.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're driven to produce more for the church. And so the matter of character, morals, value, true ethics go out the window because you have to produce. Well, this is much more typical of someone working, in a corporation, a job. I have to keep my job safety. But in this case, that same sort of job stress becomes linked to your spiritual eternity.
Yes.
Or Jeff, what I wanted to say, one of the things Tony Ortega covered with you was the ethics of political power, Scientology's worship of ruthlessness.
Mm-hmm.
So your stats go down, the Church of Scientology is ruthless. Your unit's dismantled as a result.
Exactly.
And once you lose your air cover, were you sent to the RPF?
All right, we're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to have to speed through these remaining clips. What they just talked about, I let it go on a bit long so you could hear some of their lingo again and introduce this concept of RPF. But what they're talking about is statistics, how imagine again that you go into a church, you join the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, a Baptist church or something, and imagine that the pastor or priest's evaluation of your salvation, whether you're going to heaven or hell, is determined by a number, a statistic. And that it doesn't really matter what determines the statistic, but let's say how often you serve as a greeter at the door, how often you attend sermons, what the frequency and amount of your offerings, financial offerings are, what you say about your church online. Is it positive or negative? Let's say that there's some kind of a quantifiable way to come up with a number from all of that. And of course, ultimately it's arbitrary, no matter how much you try to mechanize it and make it a objective number. That number can be manipulated, right? Let's say that that determines your eternal salvation. Is that a good church to go to? Because that's exactly what they're describing here in Scientology. The only thing that's different are the specific things that are evaluated to generate this statistic. So, whenever you have a case where people are evaluated, whenever you have a case where people's worth and their value as a human being, or their salvation, or their character, is somehow evaluated by a freaking number, at the very least, you're dealing with an oppressive and manipulative system, and at the worst, you're dealing with a cult. Because that's not how people's characters are. Every individual has a whole history of their own. They have their own personality, their own knowledge, their own temperament. They're all unique. To try to put a number on that is just, it's ludicrous, it's mean, it's dumb, and it can't serve the purpose that they claim it's going to do. What it can do is serve as an oppressive weapon, something that entices people to fight and claw to get the best number they can. But when you do that, what happens? People become ruthless. Now, it could be the people who are trying to get a good number who become ruthless to try to raise their statistics. It could be the people who are evaluating the statistics who want to be ruthless to bring another person down. But either way, you're dealing with bullshit. You're dealing with inhumanity. You're not dealing with science by any stretch of the imagination. You're dealing with a cult mentality. Because in order to accept something that ludicrous as an evaluation of a human being's worth or their character or even their performance, you are abdicating all the skills you have for interpreting reality correctly. You're abdicating critical thinking skills, you're abdicating evidence, you're abdicating the rules of logic, you're abdicating the lessons of history, you're abdicating everything. You're just going by a number. That's what Scientology does, and hopefully just with that brief explanation you can see how much trouble that introduces. Okay? Now, when it comes to Meannesota, I've already mentioned how because Meannesota is indefensible, whenever you have these websites where people tell their stories, their horror stories of their mistreatment by Meannesota, which they call Minnesota, again, because they don't understand that this cult is the dominant subculture that they're experiencing, these apologists will come out, and the only way they can defend at all, or even attempt to defend this vicious cruelty that people experience in Meannesota, is to use statistics. So they point out these polls and these surveys and studies, and again, often from the University of Minnesota, but they mean absolutely nothing. A great example, Minnesota has the highest number of churches per capita of any U.S. state. I think that's actually the results of a real study. If not, it's certainly something that they try to propagate. But all you have to do is know my story, right? With more than 100 churches that I have contacted in Minnesota, they haven't done anything other than, again, that one Catholic church gave me one night in a motel. Other than that, when I've gone to them for any help, even if it's, it's not necessarily financial help, and like I said, for many months I went with a specific plan that just plain would have gotten me out of homelessness and would have gotten me into a new apartment and a new job without costing anyone money. I mean, all I needed was people to care. That's it. So, on the one hand, you have the statistic that says, Minnesota has the most churches per capita. The implication of that, and when you're not using sound reasoning, it's easy for these apologists to portray Minnesota as the most religious state in the United States because it has all these churches. But clearly it isn't religious at all. They don't even attempt to obey the basic precepts of the Bible, which are things like the Golden Rule, the Greatest Commandment, how you treat the poor. I mean, they don't even make the slightest attempt. And then you throw in things like that Methodist pastor telling me, well, when I told her I needed help to not become homeless, and she does nothing and says, well, maybe we'll see your stuff on Storage Wars. And, when I went to this other church and they literally shut the door in my face. Glass door. They opened the door, I started speaking, and they just shut the door on me, turned around, and walked away. And this is the kind of nonsense I've encountered with all these churches. So what good is that statistic, even if it's true? The most churches per capita. They're not sincere, so who cares? They're just a tax exemption. And this is the kind of thing you encounter all the time in Meannesota. I don't care what statistics have to say. I care about what's happening in the real world. What are these people really like? And another one is where they say Minnesotans are the most charitable people in the country. They give more to charity than anyone else. And I've gone over that time and time again, using my former Minnesota employer as an example, where the only charity they give, for the most part, is to billion-dollar nonprofit organizations, and pretty shady ones at that, but they get a tax deduction from it. Meanwhile, their money is doing nothing. It's just paying for million-dollar salaries for these so-called nonprofit executives, and nobody's really being helped. And if they'd taken that money locally for people who really needed it, look on my website, a public message to the Minnesota news media. It'll tell you the story of New Brighton residents who were shot by their neighbor. Again, because the police didn't do anything about it, with 44 police calls. So the guy ended up getting shot and killed, and his girlfriend was shot. Well, the girlfriend was in peril of becoming homeless. I went to my former Minnesota employer, who had this big, huge charitable giving program. That's all they talked about, charitable giving. But they only wanted you to give to the billion-dollar charity that the president of the company was on the board of directors of. When I went there and said, hey, this woman's about to become homeless because she got shot and her boyfriend was shot and killed due to the same problem, police, that screwed me over, I think we should gather some money as a company and help her so she doesn't become homeless. They just blew it off and did absolutely nothing. So they had a chance to actually help a human being in a very real, material way, and they just did nothing. But then they raise tens of thousands of dollars each and every year for these billion-dollar nonprofit organizations that benefit the president of our company. That is Minnesota charity. So what good is the statistic? The most charitable people in the country. If it's all self-serving charity, it isn't charity. It's self-serving. And what else do you expect from a bunch of malignant narcissists? It's all about them. This woman who got shot can go to hell. Now, likewise with my former Minnesota employer, the way they evaluated me as an employee was all done through numbers and statistics. And it had absolutely zero relevance to my performance and my quality as an employee. If they had based it even on the reviews of all my coworkers, my review would have been sky high. That's how well respected I was there, and that's how good of a job I did there. But instead, they did it in their own way, using their own clever schemes to somehow turn my existence into a number. And of course, that number can be manipulated any which way they want to by management. And for their own political reasons, they did not want it to be as high as what my actual evaluation would be when they ask my coworkers, how's this guy doing? Which is sky high. So I end up with an average or, review in terms of numbers. And yet, when you read the text that goes with that number, extraordinary work. Well, how do you do that? How do you get a review that's all about extraordinary work and then you get slapped with a number that's average? That's just pure political. Now, if I wanted to raise that, how would I do it? I would have to become ruthless. I would have to throw my morality in the toilet, flush it, and then stick a big cork in the toilet to make sure it didn't accidentally come back into my life. I would have to start behaving like these people, ruthlessly. If I did that, then all of a sudden, no matter what my coworkers had to say about me, my performance number would shoot up to the extraordinary level where it belonged in the first place. That is the way a cult operates. And I don't even need to say anything else about this. Let's go on to the next clip.
Dare tell the members the real situation.
Now let's dig into this further, because this is so important. I asked you why the church can't tell the truth about its statistics, and you said that would be in theta.
Exactly.
Now, ethics has to do with honesty, integrity, in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they're saying the telling of truth would be in theta.
Mm-hmm.
It would cause upset and disturbance to tell the truth.
Yes.
So the church management has a withhold on its members about the real actual condition of the church.
Exactly.
While it's preaching that it's the most ethical group on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this goes to propaganda by redefinition of words. Why would it be okay for church management to lie to the membership? Well, on the other hand, it's an over for members to lie to management or have a withhold.
Well, that gets into this whole idea of what they call an acceptable truth or a short story.
What does that term mean? Could you tell us about how Aaron Hubbard, in his concept of the acceptable truth?
Yeah, he said, and this was in some of his PR policy letters, where he said, you have to tell the truth in PR, but then he said, but, this is a big but, you don't have to tell everything you know. Tell them something that is acceptable to the other person. And so that gives you a lot of wiggle room. Okay, what is acceptable? Well, what is acceptable for management to tell to the Scientology public is that everything's okay and the church is expanding. That's the only thing that's the only acceptable thing that they would be allowed to say. They're not allowed to say our statistics have been crashing since 1991 and the church is emptying out. They couldn't say that. So that's not an acceptable truth. So they have to tell an acceptable truth, which is also known as a lie.
All right, let's see. So according to these ex-Scientologists, a cult that portrays itself as the most ethical organization on the planet, as a matter of policy, lies and deceives and calls that acceptable truth. Now that's pretty unbelievable. I can't imagine where you would ever hear of any other organization or institution ever behaving like that, because that's pretty diabolical, that's pretty ruthless, that's just vile and disgusting human behavior. And if my website and everything I've said from the very beginning didn't make it perfectly clear that this is exactly how Meannesota operates, I wouldn't have even brought it up, would I? And with that, let's go on to the next clip.
Correct. In one essay that you did with Tony Ortega, you talked about how Scientology ethics creates a Truman Show. And not just at the level of the individual, but of the church itself.
Mm-hmm.
under the context of Truman Show, that is a make-believe world, a bubble, as Mike Rinder calls it,
Yeah.
inside the bubble. Is the net effect of ethics, on the one hand, it punishes people, but on the other hand, it's pushing people to create the Truman Show.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, this gets back to what George Orwell talked about in 1984 about what is mind control. And people sometimes think, I think, that it's somebody else controlling your mind, like a hypnotist or something like that. But that's not really it. It's true mind control is the person controlling their own mind according to the dictates of the group.
Well, that gives rise to a question. Controlling their own mind, this is where the knowledge report comes in.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, again, since I'm short on time, I have to speed through this far more quickly than I want to, because there is plenty to say on this subject. They are making the analogy between Scientology, the phony baloney world that L. Ron Hubbard created from his creative mind. They're comparing that to the movie The Truman Show. And I believe that was Jim Carrey in that movie. And in that film, this guy lived in a TV show, but he didn't know it. He thought it was his real life. But in fact, it was nothing more than a world that was created all around him for him, and he didn't even know about the real world. Now, when they say that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, that's very significant, and that was very astute of him to bring that up, because these people are entering Scientology from the real world. And the question is, how do you forget about the real world that you grew up in, assuming that you didn't grow up in Scientology, if you joined it as an adult? How do you lose sight of the fact of all those years you spent in the real world? That's the power of a cult. That is the power of a cult. You do forget about it. You lose all track of it. And if you've ever had like a major life change, and you're now many years past that, you probably get a sense of that. If you look back on the first life that you had before that major change, it literally seems like another life, like another world. You can hardly remember the details of it, right? And yet at the time, that was your reality. That was everything. So it is very possible for people to lose sight of even a reality that they lived in for decades, maybe. This self-fulfilling prophecy is where these people want to believe it so badly that they make it happen. And if they can't make it happen in the real world, then they're satisfied to just make it happen in their own mind. This concept of they want to believe is the basis for so many ridiculous beliefs that are out there. Beliefs that have no rational basis. Beliefs that are only backed up by things like incredibly thin, obviously garbage junk science. There's a lot of things like that. This isn't the time to get into that, but there are so many beliefs that people have out there that are just ludicrous. Racism. Oh my gosh, you're a different color than me, therefore you must be inferior. I need to enslave you or oppress you. Really? Seriously? To convince yourself of something like that is you making yourself believe it because you want to believe it. There isn't anything in the real world that supports that belief. You want to believe it, so you make yourself believe it. That's what a Truman Show is. Going to Meannesota. What is the myth of Minnesota nice? First and foremost, it's a myth. It isn't real. The myth says that Minnesotans are the nicest, kindest, most compassionate, most neighborly, most friendly, most charitable, most generous people on the face of the earth, to such an extent that they look down their nose at everybody else as inferior in those regards. I'm now up to 4 hours just on this one video series comparing only Scientology to Meannesota. And I could keep going for hours and hours longer. And there's a whole bunch of other videos I could create in addition to the ones that already exist. Minnesota Nice is a myth. It isn't real. It's a Truman Show. It's a fake world that doesn't exist. I'm recording this from a car because they are not the nicest, kindest, most compassionate, most friendly, most neighborly, most generous, most charitable people on the face of the earth. Quite the opposite. They don't do a damned thing to help people unless they get something out of it, because the universe revolves around them. They're malignant narcissists. That is the reality of Minnesota Nice, and that is what I call Meannesota. And unless I want to go on forever, how much more do you want me to say? Again, if you look at my former Minnesota employer, they put signs and slogans on the wall. They come up with terminology. They create this whole batshit crazy world, and they suck people into it because the employees want to believe it. Because if they don't believe it, then they have to admit openly that they're working for a cult, basically, for a management that operates like a cult, a very oppressive, mind-controlling cult. And they don't want to believe that, so they just convince themselves that they're working for an ordinary company that's doing good work. Well, there you go. The Truman Show. Now, at the tail end of that last clip, they raised the topic of knowledge reports. And what a knowledge report is, it's related to the fact that Scientologists are encouraged, if not ordered, to spy on each other. And if a Scientologist sees another Scientologist doing something they shouldn't be doing, like doubting Scientology or criticizing L. Ron Hubbard, they get reported. Doesn't sound like much of a religion, does it? Sounds a little bit more like a cult. The analogy in Meannesota is, imagine that you live in a neighborhood and that has, say, 3 or 4 known gossips. So if you do something, it might get around those 3 or 4 gossips. And that's about it. I mean, they might tell other people, but other people don't care because they're not gossips. In Meannesota, without even being a member of this cult, if you piss one of them off, or just if you do something that seems suspicious to them, you can be reported throughout a large number of people, throughout their, whoever you pissed off, throughout their little good old boy system. So it's gossiping on a grand scale, but about outsiders. And I've had this happen. I've had this happen where someone who I only recently learned even existed, and I meet this person, and the first thing they say is, "Yeah, I've heard all about you." And I'm thinking, how? Who do we exactly know in common? Who have we been talking to in common? But that's pretty creepy. That's pretty eerie. I sure don't go around. I mean, even on this website, I have done my very best to try to keep people's names out of it the best I can. I have to report public officials because these people are elected and appointed, and they can go on hurting people badly in an official capacity. But, I don't use the names of my neighbors. I give them nicknames. I haven't told you what my landlord's name is. It isn't my goal to gossip about these people, but in Meannesota, it's a whole nother story. And it's similar to knowledge reports. In fact, at my former Minnesota employer, they came right out and said it. I mean, they shocked even me with their audacity. They came right out with a program for you to spy on your coworkers and to report them to management if they do anything suspicious. And aside from how much that shoots a company in the foot in terms of morale, again, if I was a shareholder, I would not just fire that management, I would sue them for malfeasance. They have taken their role as steward of my investment and turned it into their own personal little fiefdom. And that's not their job. That's not what they're paid to do. I would make sure those people never worked in this industry ever again if I was a major shareholder. But of course, the major shareholders have no idea what's going on because Meannesota management keeps everything very secretive. Just like Meannesota keeps everything very secretive. So you've got something like a knowledge report there where you're supposed to spy on your coworkers. And again, in Meannesota, if you piss off the wrong person, word's going to get around, and you won't even know that it's happening. Unlike if you're in your neighborhood, you'll hear that those gossips down the street have been talking about you. Here, you'll never know it was happening. And then all of a sudden it'll crop up at some time when you least expected it. That's creepy. That's really, really creepy. I would rather study how the layers of dust on the moon were formed than listen to any gossip about these people. I could care less. But they thrive on hearing gossip about other people because information is power. They can use it against you, and they will. Now, with this particular video, I started out trying to talk about ethics, and for what it's worth, I did all the way through. But L. Ron Hubbard's version of ethics is so sick and twisted. It's such a contorted mess that you can see it led us off in every direction you can imagine. Up into knowledge reports. We never even got to the RPF, Rehabilitation Project Force, which some people would call human slavery, but Scientology would call rehabilitating people. Others compare it to the communist Chinese re-education camps. You're dealing with a lot of sickness here. When you deal with these kinds of cults, you're dealing with a lot of mental illness, a lot of degeneracy, and sociopathology, psychopathology. They're dangerous. They're very, very dangerous. And just to summarize the whole point of this series, I have been trying to show you that the cult, that first of all, that Meannesota is a cult, a bona fide cult. Not just me calling it a cult, throwing out names like saying Minnesotans are jerks. You know, Minnesota's a cult. That's not the case. Meannesota is a bona fide cult. And I think I've demonstrated that by showing you how it parallels in another very well-known cult, in this case Scientology. It turns out that, like I said, the cult that most fundamentally resembles the way that Meannesota operates and functions is Scientology. But Scientology only has about 30,000 members. It can stir up a hornet's nest, it can cause a lot of trouble, it can attack some critics and maybe hurt them, maybe destroy them, but every time it attacks an outsider, it's one step closer to being destroyed itself, because you can only piss off people that long before people fight back. And, you know, there's 7 billion of us and 30,000 of them. And they might think they're powerful because they have $1 billion, but nowadays there's individuals who can pull $1 billion out of their shoe and light their cigar with it. Scientology doesn't have any real power except for its intimidation factor, and, you know, like I said, they mess with the wrong person, and I bet you within 1 year Scientology will disappear from the face of the earth, and we can all look forward to that day. Meannesota is an entirely different story. Okay, you're talking about 5 million people who are directly affected by it. You're talking about countless transplants who move to Minnesota without having the foggiest idea what they're getting into. You're talking about people from all over the world who do business with Minnesota companies without understanding even the basic idea that Minnesotans are characterized by their ruthlessness and their deception and their lying. And yet these people are doing business with these companies. That they're narcissistic, they're self-centered, they think they're the center of the universe, and they will destroy other people for their own purposes. That's not something you want to do business with, right? So I'm going to bring us in for a landing now and just hope and pray that through all of this, while I make these videos sitting in a car without a script, trying my damnedest to tell you what you need to know without saying too much extra, and I'm sure I failed on that part, I really hope this helped everybody out there who's listening to this. If you're an ex-Scientologist, I think this might have helped confirm that you were right. Your instincts are correct about what your group is really like. If you're a transplant to Minnesota and you've butted heads with Meannesota and you can't figure out what is so wrong, hopefully this helps you understand that you've been dealing with a cult, and a very dangerous cult. And if you're a current Scientologist and somehow you manage to listen to this, because you're not supposed to, I'm an SP, remember? All I can say is I really hope you'll give the rest of the world a chance. If they hurt you in the past and that's what sent you into Scientology to try to find the answers, it's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. If you walked into Scientology of your own accord, you can get out of it. But you got to have a lot of moral courage, a lot of strength, and it does help if you have people who are willing to help you. There's a lot of ex-Scientologists out there who will help you get out of this. I can only ask you to think carefully about it, because that's the one thing Scientology doesn't want you to do, is to think about it. Find all of those skills you once had for interpreting reality correctly. Find your love for your family again, where you love your own parents and your siblings and your children more than you love this guy named L. Ron Hubbard, who, frankly, doesn't care anything about you. You can get out of this cult. I don't believe in deprogramming. I believe that anyone who enters a cult has to get out of it themselves. Don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid. Just want to have a good life for the rest of your life so bad that you can taste it. Fight the brainwashing. Fight that cult mentality that they're filling you with. And just do everything you can to get yourself out of it. Okay, your instincts are correct. There is something dreadfully wrong with Scientology. Like I said earlier in this series, there aren't many people who I have more respect for than people who pull themselves out of a cult, because it's very, very difficult to do. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of risk. It takes a lot of willingness to face drastic changes in your life. But I have a great deal of respect for people who do that. And maybe more important, I have a lot of happiness for them, because from the time they get out of that cult, they're finally going to start living again. And you only have one life to live. You can either give that life to L. Ron Hubbard and David Miscavige, or you can give it to yourself and your family. Please just think very hard about that before you decide to attack and destroy my life because I had the audacity to stand from the outside and to care about you. Alright? That's all I ask. And besides, another cult, Meannesota, has already totally destroyed my life. There's nothing more you can do to me. I'm a dead man already. That's the way it is, isn't it? Everyone out there, hope you enjoyed this. I can't thank you enough if you somehow listened to all 4 hours of this. My God, I hope you got something out of it, because that's what I did this for. Thank you all very much.